everyone. Good evening, saints. I will send out that in the email. I hope you appreciate it. I really mean that. And I think that's so key to what we do at Feasting with the Saints, is looking not just at the lives of these great Christian saints throughout history, but looking at what we can learn from them as well. So it's good to be together again this evening. I've still got some music playing here. Why don't I fade that French cafe out? So thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you haven't joined us before, we've started doing this once every couple of months now at Christchurch, gathering on a Friday evening, looking at the life of a great Christian saint from history. And what I love about it is, looking at the good, the bad, and the ugly about these guys, recognizing what makes them saints is not perhaps that they are extraordinary people, but that they are experiencers of extraordinary grace. And that's something that probably a lot of us can resonate with. And so that's a wonderful thing. So tonight we're looking at the great and very ancient St. Martin of Tours, which I have the great pleasure of introducing Matthew in just a moment here. Just before we do that, I want to say a huge... Say again? Well, I'm not doing the presentation, so I don't have to pronounce it right. So we'll get to that. Did you check pronunciation? Because apparently they're gonna grill you on it. So let's see what happens. Matthew's got it down. So, yes, just first off, let me say a huge thank you as always to our volunteers who provided the food and the drink this evening. Yes, a ripple of applause for them. That's fantastic. Many thanks to all of you. And with that in mind, please do kindly donate on your way out this evening. That all goes back into making sure our volunteers have a sustainable way of running things around here. And also for some of those special occasions when we actually cater Feasting with the Saints professionally, we use some of that pot to go to that. So it's a great opportunity. Please donate kindly. And before I forget, because I might forget by the end of the evening, we have a new special thing coming up next month on December the 14th, which the keen-eyed amongst you will notice is a Sunday, not a Friday. We have our first ever Coffee with the Saints, which I can't wait for. Which is December the 14th at 9:30 here in the Crump Room. Some nice coffee and Christmassy kind of treats will be prepared, and we'll have a very short presentation on the really dazzling life of Saint Nick, the real Saint Nick. Meredith.
Can I make a plug?
Yes?
So on the 14th as well, after church, I need 4 men to put up Christmas trees.
Yeah, and you'll be filled with the Christmas spirit after hearing about St. Nick, so please do sign up for that. 4 burly men, I think was Meredith's description earlier. Yes, absolutely. Tall, burly men. Yes, absolutely. Which is, yeah, it's nice to be off the hook, isn't it? Yes, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Matthew McNaughton, who's leading our presentation this evening on St. Martin of something. A ripple of applause for Matthew.
Hello. Hey. Thank you for being here, everybody. Thank you, Adam, for that lovely introduction. Welcome to this Feasting with the Saints, where we're going to be talking about... Hi? Is that better, Dorothy? Yeah. Good? Perfect. Thank you. We're going to be talking about, en français, c'est Saint Martin de Tours.
Thank you.
That's great. Je parle un petit français, oui. C'est très bien. But no, St. Martin of Tours, a really, really amazing saint, a really ancient saint, a saint who is very near and dear to my heart, that I was introduced to at a very young age. When I was 6 years old was the first time that I got to hear of this incredible man and experience a little bit of what celebrating a man like this is like, but we're going to get to that. St. Martin, it's really difficult to find a place to start because this man had an extraordinary life, a life that to some people in his life did not go the way that they wanted it to. Even in some ways, in his own way, it didn't go the way he wanted it to, but it was a life that was dedicated to service, to Christ, to God, to faith, and overcoming some pretty extraordinary obstacles. Before we dive into kind of his history, I just want to kind of go over some of the things that St. Martin is the patron saint of, and these are some things, a couple of these you're going to see as kind of a theme throughout as we kind of go over the details of his life. And first and foremost, he is the patron saint against poverty. That's a tremendously important part of his life, his work, and his journey. He's the patron saint against alcoholism and the patron saint for recovered alcoholics, which is lovely. He's the patron saint of France, befitting where he's from and Tours. Patron saint of soldiers, as well as, ironically, despite being the patron saint against alcoholism and for recovered alcoholics, he's also the patron for wine growers and makers. I'm not sure how they decide these things. It's a little bit oxymoronic, but you know what? We take it. He's also the patron for horse riders, equestrians, cavalry soldiers, and among many other things. He was a man of an extraordinary life. But as we talk about St. Martin of Tours, I think it's important to talk a little bit about how we know about St. Martin of Tours, because as Adam said, he's a very, very ancient saint. And most of what we know about him, we can thank this gentleman. This is Sulpicius Severus, quite a name. Those are his dates. He lived circa 363 to 425 AD. Sulpicius, he's sometimes a saint, sometimes not, in his own right. In the Catholic Church, they call him what we call a holy prelate or prelate, which is basically someone who's deeply spiritual, deeply gifted in their knowledge, has sort of an authority, but didn't quite reach the status of sainthood. That's in the Catholic Church at least. Our brothers and sisters in the Eastern Orthodox faith do celebrate Sulpicius as a saint. Sulpicius was what we call a hagiographer. Interesting word. It's sort of just a fancy way of saying a biographer for saints. These are people who specifically dedicated themselves to writing about the lives of saints and about their deeds, and it is pretty much almost entirely thanks to Sulpicius here that we know as much about Martin as we do, because despite the fact that St. Martin was a very dedicated minister, a very dedicated bishop and priest, he didn't really like being around people very much. Didn't like talking to many people very much outside of his duties, but he did grow to be friends with Sulpicius here, and towards the end of St. Martin's life, Sulpicius basically kind of annoyingly hung around with him and said, "Hey, tell me about stuff. What'd you do? What'd you do? What'd you do?" So he documents most of his life, his miracles. I couldn't even go over all the miracles performed that Sulpicius actually notes down in some of his works. But he knew him personally. He accompanied him in Tours towards the end of his life. He wrote a biography on him. The biography sold in what we consider ancient times like gangbusters. It went crazy. It was when Sulpicius brought his biography of St. Martin into cities, it said that book vendors started cheering because they knew that the second they had this book on St. Martin in their stock, it would sell out immediately. Now, after this, he realized that there was so much more he wasn't able to document directly from Martin himself. So a few years after Martin's death, he even went above and beyond in the city of Tours and beyond, and invited countless of people who knew Martin also personally, and wrote a second book straight from eyewitness testimony from Martin's life. So it's thanks to Sulpicius here that we know most of what we do about St. Martin. We do owe thanks to another gentleman named Gregory of Tours. He was another bishop of Tours, but about some 200 years after Martin, he had access to sort of a archive and library in the Diocese of Tours, and he was able to put together some other things that had not quite been published. But most of what we get is first-hand accounts of this man's life, and if you know anything about the recording and documentation of ancient history, having these first-hand accounts survive is miraculous in of itself. Old papyri and parchments do not keep very well at all. But let's get to the, there's Gregory of Tours. His dates, again, he's about 200 years after. He's a later source, but still reliable. So, our man, Gregory of Tours. He was born, now, the date of his birth is, The date of his birth is a little bit contested. Some scholars say he was born in the year 336 AD, but based on the writings of Sulpicius, we can probably say he was born in about the year 316 AD. We don't know the month and day, but he did live to November 8th, 397 AD. He was about approximately 80 years old when he passed away. St. Martin was a soldier, he was a priest, he was an exorcist, a mystic, a saint, all-around good guy, and we're going to dive in a little bit to his life. So he was born in what we call, well, at the time, it was called Severia, in the Roman Diocese of Pannonia. Now, this is, of course, this is early church history. This is kind of how the Diocese of the Roman Imperium existed in the year 300. So this would have been about the division of the empire when St. Martin was born. Of course, on the left-hand side, we can see the division of the Western Roman Empire, and on the right there in the blue would be the Eastern Roman Empire. Again, at this time, they're still fully united, but you know, they had some divisions, they had some differences, they had some changes. Now, he was born, as you can see, Diocese of Pannoniarum in Latin. I do not speak that, so hopefully I got that one right. I can say Tours confidently, but here I'm just kind of guessing.
You got it right.
Thank you. Yeah, appreciate that. And as you can see, where he's from, this would be the equivalent of about modern day. Now, the city he was born in is in Hungary today, but the entire diocese kind of covers what we consider Hungary, parts of Austria, Bosnia-Herzegovina, sort of the Balkan states, just east of Italy there. Now, Martin was born, unlike a lot of people, Martin was born into a Roman family. His father was a Roman, not just a Roman citizen, but he was what we would call a Roman military tribune. This is pretty much one of the highest ranks a civilian in Rome can rise to without being born into an aristocratic family, which, of course, in the Roman Empire, aristocracy was the be-all, end-all. But Martin's father, we don't know his name, we don't know the name of his father or his mother. What we do know is that his father, presumably when he was young, enlisted into the Roman military as a regular foot soldier, lowest of the low. And through dedication, through skill, through intelligence, he rose to like I said, a Roman military tribune. This would be a senior officer. Sort of an analogy I can use today is that in the Canadian military, kind of the highest rank is general. And in Rome, only aristocrats could be generals. The one below that would be a colonel. Martin's father would pretty much be a colonel, sort of the second highest rank you could achieve in the military. Just like my dad over there, crushing it. Love you, Dad. And this is a big deal, okay? So because of this, it afforded them certain benefits. Now, Martin's parents, this may be shocking, were not Christian. They were very, very pagan. In fact, Martin's name, he was named by his father after Mars, the Roman god of war. Pretty befitting for a soldier to name their son after the god of war. They were very pagan. So when they had Martin, they named him after that. And like I said, because of his high status, because of his high rank, Martin's father was not just given good pay, good salary, but he was given land. He had served in the Roman military for an extended period of time to reach what they would consider veteran status. And when you get veteran status, they would give you a few acres of land in a nice part of the empire, so you could go and spend kind of the later days of your career living nicely and not going off to war as much. So while he was born in what we consider Hungary at a pretty young age, at about the age of 3, Martin and his family moved to a place called Ticinum, which is in Pavia. This is about 20 miles from Milan in northern Italy. And it was a garrison town. Not the nicest town, it served a function. The vast majority of what went on in Ticinum was forts and training and bunks for soldiers, and that's what it was. It was a military community. Not much else there, but it did have something that would be very fundamental in Martin's life, Ticinum did have one church. This is going to come into play later, you'll see. I'm going to bring it back, just you wait. Now, in this time, in this region of the Roman Empire, Martin grew up in an extraordinarily exciting time for the Christian faith. He's born in the early 300s, and when Martin is born, Christianity is still legally persecuted in the Roman Empire. Pagans are going around and persecuting, harassing, murdering Christians. It's not a very good time. But in the year 313, they signed something called the Edict of Milan. Now, there were two sort of rival emperors, which is a theme you see throughout Roman history. Lots of emperors like to, push and shove and puff out their chests and say, no, I'm better than you. But two of them came together. One was named Licinius Augustus, and the other has a name that may sound familiar to some who may be familiar with Christian history. His name was Constantine Augustus. They signed the Edict of Milan, and initially, what it did was, while Christianity is not yet the state religion in the empire, that comes probably about another 60 years later, the Edict of Milan ended persecution of Christianity. It was basically an edict of tolerance. It meant that, no, you can't just go around to churches and harass people, you can't burn them down, you can't kill people anymore, that's not okay. Was this mainly for peace within the empire? Was it because Constantine was sort of becoming influenced by Christianity, as you kind of see later in his life? Sort of hard to really pin it down, but just before Martin is born is the first time in imperial history that Christianity is seen as, okay, it's fine, you can be Christian. And not only did it end persecution, but again, important for young Martin's life, is that it allowed Christians to practice publicly. They were allowed to do their processions, they were allowed to sing their hymns, they were allowed to hold their festivals. Now, St. Martin is born a couple years after that, and he starts to see sort of the public growth of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Of course, this is a really exciting time. You spend literally hundreds of years being persecuted, the fervor among Christians to go, yeah, we can preach and we can sing our hymns and we can express our faith. It must have felt electric for that early church and for those believers. So he's born in about the year 316, and Christianity's going on. But when Martin is 9 years old, even more than the Edict of Milan, in the year 325 AD, an even more important event takes place. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Nicene Creed. Trust me, he actually said that. No, I'm just kidding. The Nicene Creed, we recite it, most Sundays, not every Sunday. It's a foundational document for our church. Now, the Nicene Creed comes about because as Christianity is growing, and it's quickly growing at an exponential rate throughout the empire, there was some tensions between the Eastern and Western Roman Empire that I kind of showed you in the diocesan map there. So Emperor Constantine calls the Council of Nicaea in the year 325, and basically it was Constantine going, great, you guys can practice your religion, you can have your institutions, your organization, your hierarchy. You need to figure out what you actually believe. Write it down, unify, this is good. So at the Council of Nicaea, at a minimum, it's estimated about 200 bishops across the Roman Empire came together to talk, to debate, to discuss, and eventually come up with this wonderful creed that we all preach. Now this happens when Martin is 9 years old. At 9 years old, he sees sort of not just the acceptance of the Christian faith, but the unification of the Christian faith throughout the Roman Empire. This leads to when he is only 10 years old, he gets curious. He gets curious about that little church in Ticinum, and he gets curious about what's going on. This isn't pagan. What is this? These people only worship one God, and they put him up on a cross, and what's going on? And what further influenced his curiosity was, as I said, Martin's father was a super pagan. So while Martin was seeing the growth of Christianity, he was being fed stories by his father about how stupid Christians were. His father was telling him, oh, these people, they're fools. We said, give up your faith or we're going to kill you, and they just let us kill them. That makes no sense. He saw them as weak. He saw them as dumb. He's a Roman soldier, right? Strength above all. He named his son after the god of war. But these stories had the exact opposite effect on a young Martin of Tours, 10 years old, and he didn't see it as, wow, these Christians are really, really dumb. Why would they just let themselves die? He saw this as, wow, they were willing to die for this. And so that piqued his interest. At 10 years old, he curiously goes into this church at Ticinum, and his mind is blown. At the outside, it's kind of important to note that old Roman churches, oftentimes the buildings that they were in would just be old villas. Villas that weren't being used. On the outside, it just looked like a house, maybe a little bit worn down, could use a fresh coat of paint. But like a lot of Christians, once you go through those doors, it was a completely different world. The iconography, the beauty, the community. One of the things that Martin would have seen at this time that wouldn't have been necessarily as common in the Roman Empire was everyone was in church together. Everyone. Men and women were together. Rich and poor were together. Young and old were together. And that's not something you really see in a super, super hierarchical society like the Roman Empire. So this is all new to him. He saw baptisms get performed. And at the time, baptisms were kind of viewed as this like strange, mystical thing throughout the Roman Empire. Why are they dunking these people in water? We take baths. This makes no sense. But the air around it, the gravity of what a baptism was, it sparked something in him. He listened to the hymns, the songs that they were singing, and not just the hymns that they were singing about, older saints or hymns to God or some hymns to Mary or anyone like that, but he also heard them singing hymns about the same martyrs that his father was chastising, that his father was mocking and making fun of. And it sort of created this cognitive dissonance in his head, Why is my father saying all these terrible things about these people, but clearly in this community they're so beloved? What is it that makes these Christians so different? And again, he's 10. Wise beyond his years. He also hears the gospel for the first time. He hears the message for the first time. He would have heard that preached. He would have heard the gospel. He would have heard the Old Testament too. He also learned a little bit about hermits and monks and the monastic societies, which is going to play a pretty big role in his life later. We're going to get to that. He also saw, and at this time this was much more common, churches would have multiple exorcists. And he saw exorcists, what they would do is usually after any services that would take place at the church in Ticinum, when all the goings-on were done, the exorcists would sit on the front porch of the church and they would spend the rest of their day until they fell asleep serving people that Roman society saw as the least, people that Roman society saw as the dregs of society, the unclean, the poor, the sick, the lame. One of the words that Suspicious uses a lot when describing these people from a Roman perspective is he uses the word wretched a lot, and that's how these people were seen. But Martin saw these exorcists, these priests, these deacons, treating them with dignity and with respect, and it definitely sparked something in him. So again, at the age of 10 years old, he knew he wanted to be baptized. He saw this world, he was captivated by it, he wanted to learn more, he wanted to be a part of this. And he goes to the bishop of this local church at 10 years old and annoyed him to no end. He would literally knock on his door, pull at his robe, saying, please, I want to be baptized. Let me be a catechumen, someone who's entering the church and has to go through the process of being a part of that. And so he begged for that, and as he continued going to church, by age 12, again, 12 years old, he knew that he wanted to be what is described as a man of the desert. A hermit, a monk, someone closed off. I don't know too many 12-year-olds who want that, but it was a big thing for Martin. Now, he spent his days after joining the church at about 10 years old, not fully joining again. He was living as a part of the faith, but he's not baptized. He's still sort of in the beginning days, but he's joined the community. He's doing his best to live the faith. He goes there. He spends a lot of time actually away from his home. It's described as, in military terms, he's said he's on leave without absence, which is a big deal when your father is a Roman military man. The fact that his son is spending no time around the garrison, no time training on his horse, no time training with a sword, a shield, a spear. He's just spending all of his time with these weird, hippy-dippy, poor people doing their best to wash dirty people. It was gross to them. But Martin was all in at this young age. And actually what he would do that was super formative for his life is that he would listen, he would stand by windows, because as a non-baptized, non-catechumen member, he wasn't necessarily allowed into the services, but he would climb up on windows and listen to the preaching through the windows and listen to the hymns of that. And then afterwards, he was so fascinated by the exorcists that he spent most of his time sitting on the porch of this church with the exorcists, watching them heal people, watching them talk to people, and he would ask them questions and learn more about the faith. And he loved it. He loved it, he loved it, he loved it. His father hated it. His father eventually had enough. But we're going to get to that in a second, because I want to pose a question. It's not a difficult one. I want you to think of yourself as a young Saint Martin. You're 10 years old, this new religion blows up in the empire, it's expanding at a rapid rate, it's nothing like you've ever seen before, it's nothing like the religions around you. How do you think you would react? I mean, of course, like his father and like countless Romans, this is something that was considered silly and weak and, completely unnecessary, absolutely ridiculous, something as a waste of time. Super counterintuitive to anything that pagan Romans taught. So would you, how do you think you would feel? Imagine you knew nothing about Christianity. Nothing at all. You're a little kid, you walk into a church, and you see these strange people with beautiful paintings on the walls, and they're talking about eating someone's body and drinking his blood, and, I feel like that, I'm just going to speak for myself here, it probably would have turned me away as a kid. That would probably scare me. How do you think some of you guys would feel if this was something that was completely different to your life? Any takers? Any givers? Yeah.
But it sounds like Martin had a bit of a rebellious independent streak. There might have been the fact that this was sort of a countercultural influence that it ran against his parents. Maybe that might have been part of what attracted him to it.
You're onto something, and we're going to get to that. Does anyone else? No?
Didn't hear the question.
So if you knew nothing about Christianity, like young Martin of Tours, nothing at all, you're a pagan, you see this church, you see how they worship, how do you think you would react? Would
Can I join?
Yeah.
Can I get involved? What do I have to do?
That's exactly how he did. But for anyone who's outside, most of the people would have thought otherwise, right? Now, you were definitely onto something, because Martin certainly had a little bit of a rebellious streak in him. He didn't really want to be a soldier, he didn't want to fight, he didn't want to go to war, he didn't want to do anything like that. His dad did want him to do something like that. Now, at around this time, about the time as a few years pass, Martin is about the age of 15 years old. And around this time, there's some growing threats within and outside the Roman Empire. So, Emperor Constantine, along with his son Constantinus, they actually began to issue formal statements of conscription in every single garrison town in the Roman Empire. They started putting up these posters that said, if you are a young man, specifically aged 20 to 25, you have to enlist in the Roman military. Martin went, whatever, I don't have to worry about that right now. I'm only 15 years old. He did have to worry about it, however. His dad, growing increasingly frustrated with his son's lack of commitment to paganism, his lack of commitment to the military, his lack of commitment to what he thought it meant to be a good, upstanding Roman man, went to an enrollment officer, used his position, like I said, as a senior Roman official, told the enrollment officer about his son, told the enrollment officer about his son's rebellious streak and his lack of desire to join this. And the enrollment officer followed Martin's father back to their villa, not just with conscription papers, but with a pair of handcuffs. Martin's dad was done with it. So at the age of 15, before he can get baptized, Martin is literally shackled and thrown into a cart and forced into conscription at the age of 15 into the Roman military. It wasn't all bad. Martin, despite his forced conscription, owing to his father's status, was owed a lot of privileges that other soldiers weren't permitted. So one of the things is, right off the bat, Martin was elevated to a higher rank. He would have been like a junior officer. Part of that meant that he was given double the ration of food of an average soldier. That's not too bad. Martin was allowed to bring his own horse or horses, which he probably had multiples of, considering his father was given approximately about 5 acres of land. So he was allowed to bring his own horses. He was also, again, owing to his rank, allowed to bring with him a servant. So yeah, he was conscripted, but it wasn't that bad. Well, sort of. I mean, I guess not for the 4th century. I wouldn't be too keen on it myself. But part of these privileges, he didn't just get the benefit of having more food. He didn't get the benefit of just having a nice horse that he could ride around. He had the benefit of leisure time, something that most soldiers do not get to have. So what did he do? Did he spend his time in leisure training, training with his sword? Did he spend his time reading battle tactics? Did he spend his time, reading the great works of philosophers and trying to become a great, upstanding Roman? No. Any free time that Martin had, he dedicated to continuing his life of faith. He dedicated it to prayer. He dedicated it to fasting. He dedicated it to treating and serving the other men that he served with very well. In fact, it's noted that his servant, Martin invited him to share the same room. That's kind of a big deal. A servant? No, that is not acceptable. But Martin didn't call him a servant, he called him a brother. He treated him with respect. He treated him with kindness. Sulpicius notes that he spent every penny he had outside of what he needed to survive daily, what he needed for food daily. He gave it all away. He spent his time assisting, what he says again, quote, the wretched, supporting the needy, clothing the naked. And he's doing this all before the age of 18. This is a 15-year-old guy. This would not be me, is what I will say about that. And he really did fully dive into it. And this all leads to the most important moment of Martin's life. This is a moment that we call the Charity of St. Martin. Now, in some of the pictures you'll see, and this is something, if you Google St. Martin, almost every single picture you see of him painting, fresco, whatever, it'll all sort of look like this. There will be a poor person, there'll be Martin with a sword going at his cloak. Now, the background for this, he's just before the age of 18, he's trying to live his life of faith. He's trying to do everything he can for the people who are less than him. And there are a lot of people less than him, a lot. And what happens is, as his time goes on, he's stationed near a city named, I think it's Amiens, not sure how to say that, I will admit that, thank you. And I'm just going to quote exactly what happened from how Sulpicius describes it from Martin's own mouth. Sulpicius says, quote, at a certain period when Martin had nothing except his arms and his simple military dress, in the middle of the winter, a winter which had shown itself more severe than ordinary, so that the extreme cold was proving fatal to many, Martin happened to meet at the gate of the city of Amiens a poor man destitute of clothing. The poor man was entreating those who passed by to have compassion on him, but all passed that wretched man without notice. When Martin, that man full of God, recognized that a being to whom others showed no pity was in that respect left to him, he saw it as his duty to do something. Everyone else is ignoring this man. He had the means, so he thought he had to help. So what does he do? He sees this man, he pulls out his sword, the man gets scared, But instead of turning the sword on the man, Martin takes his cloak and he divides it into 2 equal-sized pieces. And he drapes it around the poor man and covers himself with the remainder of the rest. What's interesting is that a lot of people laughed at him. Well, yeah, that's to be expected, but and what also happened is something that you still see a lot of today. A lot of people laughed at Martin, but it's said that a lot of people started groaning because after Martin gave this man the cloak, they went, "Oh man, I should have done that. He looks really good. And now I look like a jerk." And they were. No, don't hold it against him. So, it was it was a mixed reaction. Martin didn't think anything of it. He thought he was just doing his duty. He thought he was living a life that Christ would want him to live. Day goes by, nothing happens, and then another day goes by, and the second half of this event takes place. 2 days after he cuts his cloak, he lays down to sleep, and again, to quote Sulpicius says, "He had a vision of Christ in his dreams, arrayed in that part of his cloak with which he had clothed the poor man. He contemplated his Lord with the greatest attention and was told to own as his the robe which he had given. Ere long he heard Jesus saying with a clear voice to the multitude of angels standing around, 'Martin, who is still but a catechumen, clothed me with this robe.'" It's a pretty powerful moment, I would say. It's a pretty special moment. And it all goes back to Scripture. One of my favorite lines in all of Scripture, what does Jesus say? He says, "What you do for the least of you, you do for me." And that one line of Scripture you will see is the thread that follows his entire life, from when he was 10 years old, seeing that church in Ticinum, all the way up until his death. So following this event, following this dream, Martin felt like, okay, I can't keep delaying this. He goes to the local bishop of the city. He approaches the bishop, who had been observing Martin in his time stationed there. Roman soldiers tend to act a certain way, and when one of them isn't acting that way, it tends to draw attention. So they kind of knew about him. But Martin approaches the bishop, and the bishop accepts him for the final preparations to finally be baptized at around the age 18. So it's the year 334 AD. He's accepted for the final preparations of baptism. And these final preparations are about 6 weeks of very intense preparation, 6 weeks of prayer, of fasting, of helping the priests and the deacons and the bishops with their daily tasks. It's not for the faint of heart. And what is interesting to note is that this 6-week period of intensive prayer, meditation, and fasting that they used to do in the ancient church is believed to be where we get our 40 days of Lent tradition. These catechumens were told to give up the world, focus on prayer, and that's sort of carried through to today, where we give up what we give up for Lent. After these 6 weeks, Martin is baptized on Easter Day. It's a pretty special day. At the time, it's called the Christian Passover, formally baptized into the body of Christ. However, he still remains in the military, mainly because he's conscripted and because he had about another 20 years to fill out on his contract. So he gets baptized and he's like, yay, but then he doesn't get to do what he wants. Not quite. He remains in the military, but as his faith and dedication grew, he sort of changed his role. He went from a soldier, a man bearing arms, to trying to find any way he could to live out his faith within the confines of this strict military system that he was a part of. So he shifts to a role called a medicus, which I'm sure you can hear the root word there. He basically becomes a medic. And this is extraordinarily important for Martin, not just because he gets to continue serving people. In fact, he uses his skills not just for soldiers, but it's noted that he would help civilian and soldier alike. But this is probably where Martin got and we'll get into some of what he did later in the future, but a lot of his time was spent healing people, and this is probably where he got most of his training. Medics at the time, because medicine was very primitive at this time, were basically field surgeons and emergency physicians as best they could be. So he got a lot of training here and did what he could. Eventually, after about 22 years, another 22 years of military service following his baptism, as he continues to grow in notoriety and in stature and in sort of renown, he comes face to face with a young emperor named Julius. Now, at this time, Martin had sort of found peace in his role in the military. He saw a way that he could live his Christian faith in these confines. But when Julius visits his garrison, Julius, unlike Constantine, who was very open to and accepting of Christians, Julian was the exact opposite. Julian was pushing for hardcore paganism. He wanted to put the Roman gods back in the rightful places. He wanted them to be everywhere. He wanted them to be the only thing that was talked about. In fact, at this time, on the Roman banners, it wasn't the traditional eagle that we typically see associated with the Roman Empire. The symbol on the banners was the Chi Rho, the very famous Christian symbol. So Julius wanted to get rid of all that. And after having this encounter with Julius, it's pretty clear that it left quite the mark on Martin, because without saying much, he then just leaves. He leaves the military. He probably goes, I can't do this anymore. They're trying to push what I believe is wrong, and if I stay a part of this, I think it'll just be detrimental to my growth, to my faith, and to my life. So he leaves the military, he goes on, and he hears about vibrant Christian communities in sort of the west of the Roman Empire, in the areas that we traditionally now refer to as Germany, as France, and he hears that in these places are a lot of extraordinary theologians, teachers, priests, mentors. So what does he do? He throws his pack over his shoulder and he just starts walking. He starts walking in the direction of France. He's following his heart, he's following his faith. He thinks he's just walking towards freedom, but what he doesn't know is he's walking directly to another one of the greatest saints of our faith, and a man who would then be instrumental in the rest of Martin's life. As Martin travels to France, he meets this gentleman. This gentleman is Saint Hilary of Poitiers. Now, some of you might recognize that name because Hilary of Poitiers is what we call one of the church fathers, the early church fathers. These are men who wrote, it's literally a library, it's like 3 shelves big of all the church fathers, extraordinary works on theology, on faith, on life. And so Martin is walking towards France, and he happens to be heading directly to Hilary of Poitiers. And just to kind of give you an idea of what this man is, Hilary of Poitiers, he's the bishop of Poitiers, but he's more than that. Some of the names that he has, one of the titles that some of you may be familiar with, is he is a doctor of the church. Not many people are given that title. St. Thomas Aquinas is a doctor of the church. Most recently, Pope Leo named John Henry Newman, St. John Henry Newman, a doctor of the church as well. So that's to put it in perspective of what he is. But he isn't just a writer. He's also called the Hammer of the Arians. Now, if anyone knows anything about the Arians, they were a group of people that St. Nick did not like very much, as you will learn on the 14th. The Arians were a group of Christians that rejected the divinity of Christ. Kind of an important thing to not reject in our faith, but they were really for that. And so Hilary is a man who, he's called the Hammer of the Arians because this is a man full of zeal, passion, and fervor for the truth of what it all is. He's outspoken. In fact, he's so outspoken, he gets censured by the Roman imperial government. And again, this is just a random bishop in France. This man is of such character that directly to Emperor Constantine, St. Hilary of Poitiers writes, I say to thee, Constantinus, what I would have said to Emperor Nero, what Decius and Maximinus would have heard from me. It is against God you fight, against his church you rage, you persecute his saints, you hate those who preach Christ, you take away the true religion. Those are fighting words from a random bishop to the Emperor of Rome. This is the kind of guy that Martin is walking directly towards. So they meet. He arrives in the mid-300s in Poitiers, and he meets Hilary, and they hit it off pretty quickly. In fact, Hilary sees something in Martin. He sees a compassion and a conviction in him, such to the point where, as previously Martin was harassing bishops to get baptized, Hilary starts harassing Martin to get ordained. Now, Martin didn't want to get ordained. He was too humble. In fact, he genuinely saw himself as unworthy of ordination. He just wanted to be a follower and do what he could for the people. But Hilary wouldn't let up. And eventually, he initially convinces Martin to be ordained a deacon, and after a little bit of time as a deacon, he pushes, and Martin is eventually ordained priest. Now, why did Hilary push so hard? Did it have to do with what a guy Martin was? Yes, he saw that Martin was a man of conviction, a man of importance. But St. Hilary of Poitiers is getting to the end of his time as a leader in his community. He's getting old, and in Martin he saw a person that he could trust to lead his congregations. And there's not many people that he thought he could. But another reason is beyond that. Like I said, he's throwing fighting words to the Roman emperor. Hilary knew that Martin was a senior officer in the Roman military. Now, even though he was a Christian, even though he left the military, that still meant something to Roman officials. So, in one way, yes, he loved Martin, but he also saw a way that Martin could be beneficial to the cause. Hilary's just a random guy from France, but if a senior imperial officer starts preaching the same things he does, people sort of have to listen to him. So they grow quite close, and Martin continues growing, and he gets ordained, and he performs his duties admirably, even though it's noted that he absolutely detested the internal politicking of the church. He hated it. He understood that Arians were wrong, but he didn't want to spend his time at councils and debating people. He wanted to help people. So as he goes on, he has a meeting with Hilary one day, and he's talking to Hilary about the most pressing matters of the church, and St. Hilary says, well, of course, the most pressing matter of the church is the politicking, and we can't let the Arians divide us, and we have to keep the church united. And Martin says, no, actually, the most pressing matter of the church isn't politicking, it's the soul. We have to do something about that, because Martin spends his days with these downtrodden people. He spends the days seeing the rot that's starting to grow within the Roman Empire that eventually leads to its total collapse. And in fact, it's at this time that, as they're speaking, Martin talks to Hilary about the impact that those exorcists in Ticinum had on him, and how those exorcists left an impact on his life, and how Martin thought that the job of the exorcists, freeing people from the possessed and from afflictions of the devil and demons, he saw that as the most important part of the church. So hearing that compassion, hearing that conviction, Hilary appoints... I'm so glad some of you are getting that. I love this movie. St. Hilary appoints Martin as an exorcist, and he gives Martin the freedom to go on his way and do his job. He understood that he was having a hard time kind of leashing Martin, so he said, you know what, if this is what you're going to do, go with my blessing and do it fully. So Martin becomes an exorcist, and he basically becomes a traveling exorcist. Just like he did when he left the military, he throws a pack on his back, and he hits the road, and he basically does an entire lap of France. He goes from where he was in Poitiers all around every coastline of France and back that we would know. He does a huge trip, and this is not an easy trip for Martin. I mean, on one hand, it's noted that he loved the isolation it had. Martin, like I said, he wasn't really fond of interpersonal communication. He loved people, but he saw the value in being by himself and of quiet contemplation and of prayer. So on one hand, yeah, he loved walking by himself. On the other hand, he was robbed multiple times. He was almost murdered a few times. In fact, one of the only things that saved him from murder was his faith. He was about to be executed by a criminal. The criminal raises his axe and says, "Why aren't you afraid?" And Martin says, "Well, I don't have to be. I've got God." And that robber lowers the axe, respects him, and goes, "You know what? All right," and lets him keep going on his way. And it's rough. He has to deal with robbers. He has to deal with the weather. Martin, being a man of humility, did not dress well or nicely. He'd be exposed to the elements quite a bit. And it's on this harrowing trip that Martin has his first encounter with what is described as his greatest enemy and adversary of all time. I think it'd be fair to say he's probably all of our greatest enemies and adversaries of all time. Martin has his first encounter with the devil himself. He's walking on a road to France, and he sees a man standing with a twisted face. It's said that this man was Satan in a human form. Satan asks him, "Where are you going?" And Martin tells him. He doesn't care. He goes, "Yeah, this is where I'm going." And it's reported that the devil tells him, "Wherever you go or whatever you attempt, the devil will resist you." That'd shake me a little bit, I think. But Martin, undeterred, looks right at the devil, and he says, "The Lord is my helper. I will not fear what man can do unto me." And it said that when he says these words, the devil vanished. Couldn't hack it. Guy's kind of a loser. Not a great guy. So he continues his ministry, and he spends his time traveling throughout France, performing exorcisms, healing people. In fact, it's reported that on this journey, he has 2 miraculous accounts of resurrection. He brought 2 people back from the dead. One was a sick person. He was called in. They begged him. They said, Martin, you are a holy man. Please save this person." When he gets there, they weren't breathing. So it's reported that Martin bent over, whispered a prayer, kissed the person, and all of a sudden, they were back up. That was the first. The second happens as he continues to travel. He's walking through a small town, and there's a little bit of a hubbub going on near a barn in the town. Martin goes to see what's going on, and it turns out that a slave actually tried to hang himself. And when Martin got there, the body was hanging from a noose, cold, lifeless, and they thought, "Oh, we have to bring him down. Martin helps to go bring him down, and when he brings him down, he removes the noose from the man's neck, and the slave gets back up. Went from being stone cold to alive again. And these are just 2 of some of his miraculous recordings. He did a tremendous number that if I was here, we'd be here till midnight talking about everything he did. And he loved it, and he spent his time traveling. He loved the isolation of the road, and he was pretty happy, and he thought that finally things would go well for him. He had his freedom. He could follow his faith. He had the blessing of his bishop, and he could, do what he could to pursue what he wanted. Unfortunately, until this guy kicks the bucket. This gentleman is Litorius of Tours. He was the 2nd bishop of Tours. He passed away circa sometime in 371 AD, and the bishops of the area are in a hubbub. They go, "Oh gosh, we need to get someone to replace Litorius." Well, at the time, despite his not wanting to be, Martin had been making an even bigger name for himself. So the bishops pretty quickly agree, "Hey, we should get this Martin guy to be the bishop of Tours." So they send an envoy to Martin, and they go, "Martin, we see what you're doing. We see how you live your faith. We see that you are truly a soldier of Christ. We want you to take this sacred honor and be consecrated the bishop of Tours." Martin looks at the envoy and goes, "Nah." And they go, "What?" He's like, "No, not interested. Find someone else." And they did not take that for an answer. So there's 2 accounts here. They're sort of going back and forth, but one of the accounts is that they sent someone to Martin, another envoy, and he said, Martin, please, someone needs healing. We know you're a healer. Please, come and heal this person." So Martin, being the dutiful soldier of Christ that he is, goes and he goes, "Of course I will help heal this person." And when he goes, he enters the church, and the bishops basically pop out and go, "Gotcha!" and consecrate him bishop. That's the first account. The second account is my favorite and even funnier. They send envoy after envoy to Martin, and he keeps saying no. So eventually, they send a few envoys together and literally drag Martin, kicking, screaming, and shouting, lifting him up, grabbing his arms and his legs, and saying, "Nah, you're coming with us." And they carry him to Tours, plunk him down, despite his protestation, and they consecrate him the bishop of Tours. I don't think that's how any of our bishops get consecrated today. I think we've sort of moved past that. But in the ancient world, that's sort of how it happened. I mean, at the last feasting of the saints, we talked about St. Augustine. Sort of the same thing happened. His good friend Ambrose basically called him up And when he came to visit his buddy, he just said, "Oh, hey, nice to see you. Glad you're here. By the way, you're bishop now." They could just kind of do that back then. So Lytoris passes away. Martin is made bishop, and despite the fact that he was reluctant, he is a quick learner. He takes to the job very, very passionately. In fact, he pretty quickly does some pretty interesting things. Despite his reluctance, he immediately starts doing things like destroying pagan temples and altars. He has them all broken, destroyed, burnt, gotten rid of. He saw paganism, again, probably as a part of that rebellious streak from his mother and father, but he saw it as wrong, so he quickly got to destroying them. In fact, but more than that, he wasn't just targeting pagans. Now that he was bishop, despite him not wanting to be, he had a real problem with people who wanted to be bishops but didn't act like it. So he started deposing other bishops. Because, of course, he could. Now, I do want to say it's important to note that every document says he did it the right way. Martin wasn't just kicking in doors and saying, "Get out of here." No, he was actually going through the channels of the church and making cases and saying this person isn't living up to their pastoral duties. They shouldn't be bishops. So he was deposing bishops. He actually introduced a very early version of the parish system in his diocese. The parish system was a pretty long development through church history and wasn't necessarily standardized, but he started to develop the parishes, and he made it a point as bishop, he would visit every single parish in his diocese at least once a year. He made sure that he got face time with his priests, with his deacons, with all the congregations. He set up his headquarters, instead of living in a beautiful bishopric or a palace or anything like that, he built a monastery instead. And he lived in that monastery and worked from there. But along with that, he started building other monasteries all throughout his diocese and encouraging the monastic and contemplative life. He also did something that was pretty incredible. He actually was able to influence everyday Roman life outside of Christian life. It was in his diocese in the Roman Empire. He set up an office that was called a defensor. A defensor would be not a high-ranking official, but a representative to the imperial government on behalf of the people and for the protection of the people. He sets this office up, and this spreads throughout the Roman Empire. So this is something that, all he wanted to do was do what he could for the people of his diocese, but the profound impact it had, his desire to help the people who had no power, just like Christianity originally, it spread like wildfire throughout the Roman Empire, and this became a standardized office in both the East and the West in the Roman Empire, of which, of course, when he sets up this office, he takes place as the defensor for the city of Tours. So he sets up this office and takes it upon himself to make sure that he is the one serving and protecting his people. And as a bishop, he continues his life of service. He continues to be a dedicated minister. He continues healing, performing exorcisms. He continues doing all these wonderful things, serving the poor, serving the infirm. In fact, he recorded so many, like I said, Sulpicius had to write 2 different books on everything that Martin did. And after a long life of dedicated service, Martin of Tours died in the year 397 AD, and his death was felt throughout the Roman Empire. People began to make pilgrimages to his church. In fact, it's recorded by some that in his funeral procession, just of monks alone, there were over 2,000 monks, all dressed in the white robes and habits that he instituted for his monastic societies, leading the procession of his funeral. People would weep for him. People began going to his tomb and praying. Post-mortem miracles started to occur, and it was really felt throughout. He really was a wonderful, wonderful man, but his influence didn't stop in the year 397. It continues to this very day. In fact, we feel the influences right here at Christ Church. Does anyone want to guess why Adam's on the big screen? Anyone know where I'm going with this?
Because they're forcing me to be a bishop.
I haven't heard that, but watch it out. One of the big things that is a part of the legacy of St. Martin is the word chaplain. We all pretty much know what chaplains are and the roles they fill, but at the time, this all goes back to that famous moment when St. Martin cuts his cloak in half and gives it to the poor man. After his death, during his life and after his death, the cloak that he wore became a sacred relic. Because it wasn't a full cloak, it was half of a cloak, they began to call it a capella. And it was put in a sacred reliquary, and it was guarded in what they started to call a capella, a chapel. And the people who guarded the capella were called capellanos, chaplains. So it's thanks to St. Martin of Tours that we get chaplains, that people like Adam and many other wonderful people all across the world in military and independent organizations, prison chaplains, all these people. This all goes back to that cutting of the cloak, to that desire to serve people who need help. It's all thanks to him that we get the word chaplain. Of course, we are celebrating this in November. We're talking about him in November. It's very fitting that St. Martin's actual feast day is November 11th. One of the reasons many people think for this is because before he did all this, he was a soldier. He ministered to soldiers before he ministered to anybody else. So we still feel his legacy, we still feel that desire to serve, and that's present all throughout Christian history that I'm not even sure we would feel maybe as intensely if we didn't have role models like St. Martin of Tours to set that example for us 1,700 years ago. And in fact, some places in Europe, they still hold him in very high regard. In fact, one of the things that you'll see at all your tables are these small lanterns. That was intentional. When I was a boy, when I was 6 years old, we moved to Germany. My dad was in the military. We moved to Germany. In fact, our house in Germany was right next to a church. And the German people of our town, very nice, very kind. One day, their town was getting ready to hold some big celebration for some saint. And they came to our door and they invited us and asked us if they wanted to take part in it. And we said, sure, why not? We'll take part. Turns out that this is St. Martin's Day. Because of where he was, yes, it's modern day France, but in that area of the Roman Empire, it was more than just French people. It was Germanic people, including British people as well, Germans, Austrians, Dutch, things like that. They still hold him in very high regard as kind of an icon of their region of Europe. So what the tradition is little kids from the town all get together and they make little paper lanterns. You make them out of paper and you paint them up and you put them on a little stick and you light a candle in them, and the whole town does a procession from wherever the town decides to their local church while all the kids and adults sing songs about St. Martin and about him cutting his cloak and about him serving people. He's still felt today, he's still loved today. I love him very much. I think he's been a tremendous influence on my life. And he's a pretty great guy. This right here, I just want to show this. You can visit him if you like. This is the Basilica of St. Martin in Tours. Now the basilica itself is unoriginal because some grumpy people didn't like Christianity, as that tends to happen and trend throughout history, so they destroyed it, but they did not destroy his tomb, which is on the right there. So if anyone is interested, you can pay your respects to St. Martin to this day by going to his basilica and seeing his tomb there. And that's mostly it. That's St. Martin of Tours, a man who dedicated his life to Christ, to service, to helping those who the empire would not help. So I just want to kind of close off and ask, in this story, did anything strike you about St. Martin of Tours? Was anything, what would you admire about him? What did you learn? What can you take away from him? Just for me, as I continued to read about him, the thing that stood out to me was his extraordinary maturity at so young an age. 10 years old and seeing these traditions and rituals and knowing how important they were and beautiful they were, desiring to be a part of this community, but even still at that young age, wanting to dedicate his life to poverty and to servitude. It shows tremendous spiritual and emotional maturity for someone so young that is extraordinarily uncommon then and now. That's kind of what I took away. But anyway, yeah.
Courage.
Yeah.
In the face of so many roadblocks, dangerous roadblocks at the time.
Yeah. And again, he just had to do all kinds of things he didn't want to do, but he always addressed what he had to do with grace and with dignity, and he got the job done, I'd say. Anyone else?
You know, I like that he just knew. He just had a knowing, and he
didn't, he bucked his father and that, but just kind of stayed to that line, so much so that they hunted him down and said, "You're a bishop now."
Yeah. Yeah,
That
he knew exactly what he
Yeah,
wanted to
like-
do. Yeah. I wish I did. This
Yeah,
is the
yeah.
third time I'm in post-secondary school. Hopefully this will stick.
The same here.
Yeah, well, we're getting there, but if only I could have some conviction, that would have made life a lot easier. Anyone else? Yeah, Adam.
I like the two images of him handcuffed and conscripted on the one hand, and then being dragged into the bishopric, because I think calling, we often think of calling and vocation as, I found something I'm passionate about and I want to do. But it's often God dragging you kicking and screaming into something you don't want to do. And then I think the test of courage is to say, I don't want to do this, but God's called me to it, so I'll be dutiful in it. And that approach of his to, once he becomes a soldier, he takes it seriously. He's there for 20 years. Once he becomes a bishop, he takes it really seriously. And I think that's really admirable, even though he didn't want to do those things initially.
Yeah. I don't know if I'd have that level of grace. I feel like I'd be pretty petty. But he wasn't, yeah.
It's interesting how you described the exorcists in the early church. I know it sort of has that office is sort of has a bit of a bad name in modern circles, and it's interesting that they're really servants of the people and that they're healers, and probably they had a lot of knowledge and really understood mission and caring for the lesser, based on the knowledge that they had at the time. So that was really an interesting perspective on what exorcists did and their role in the early church based on the kind of their knowledge and their worldview that they had at the time. So that was really.
Yeah, absolutely. In the early church, because this community, and like I said, he's at this period of the church that is growing at an exponential rate. So the church needed to have separate offices to delegate work. The deacons and the priests were way too busy performing all the services they had to do, the Eucharist and everything else they had to do. So you're absolutely right. Yeah, nowadays we see exorcists like that movie as these shadowy clergy that show up in the middle of the night saying, "The power of Christ come upon you," and throwing around the holy water. But in the early church, yes, deliverance, as we call it, deliverance was a part of their purview, but they were the clergy that, along with that, mainly ministered to the poor and to the sick. And it's interesting seeing how that's sort of changed. Yeah.
So you were saying at the beginning, of course, he hadn't been baptized and he wasn't actually going into church, and then he goes off on his own. He's being a charitable individual, but I would assume that he's making it up on his own because he hasn't been in church, so he doesn't know how to follow whatever their current doctrine is. So my question is, with respect to that, once he eventually is taken and they say, "We now want you to be a bishop," does there become a set of parameters that he works within, plus he has a moderating effect, or is he his own independent thing that creates its own new system that is indoctrinated in the church going forward?
It's a great question. Bishops at this point in early church history are a little bit more autocephalous. They're a little bit more independent. That being said, this is post-Council of Nicaea. So there was a degree of unity that needed to be adhered to. It's not when he becomes a bishop this happens, and I wasn't able to touch on this, but it's actually, you're right, for a huge chunk of his life he leaves the military when he's about the age of 40. Is about the age that he leaves the military, and he's doing his best to live his life of faith. But it's not until he meets Hilary of Poitiers that he actually learns the doctrine of the Trinity, that he actually learns the divinity of Christ scripturally and biblically, that he actually learns the Eucharist and baptism. So he was really just making it up based on what he saw through the window, or based on what he saw. Like I said, they were allowed to perform, or not perform rather, they were allowed to worship in public at this point in the Roman Empire, so he would have just been witnessing what these early Christians were doing. And I think it's quite clear that he was a pretty intelligent man, so he was probably quite observant at seeing, okay, this is what they're doing, these are the prayers that I'm hearing, this is how I should follow it. But it's not until he's about 41 that he actually learns the true structure of the church, and he continued to live that to its fullest. Yeah.
And And so when he does learn it,
Mhm.
through what you've read, does he step in line with it and follow it forward, or does he have a moderating effect on it?
He very much stepped in line with it. He was, I mean, and it's hard to not see why when you're taught by a man like Hilary of Poitiers, who was so, so ardent in his faith and so dedicated to the fullness and trueness of the faith, going against this. I mean, Arianism almost destroyed the early church. It was extraordinarily damaging. In fact, I believe at one point there were more Arian bishops in the church than there were Trinitarian bishops, which is almost diabolical to think about. But I feel like it's not only was he a very intelligent man and could probably reason with the gospel and the scripture that he heard, but then being taught by another man like Hilary of Poitiers, someone who was so dedicated, someone whose writings we can read today that defend the Trinity, that defend this. He was pretty quick to go, this makes sense. Yeah.
Did he ever get baptized?
Yes, he did, yeah.
How did they get in order to get baptized?
Sorry, say that again, please?
He was pushing the bishops to baptize him.
Yeah, he was. It's something that, nowadays it's a little bit of a more expedited process, but back then there was it was a much longer process. In fact, you can actually still see this today in sort of the Eastern Orthodox Church. When you become a catechumen in the Eastern Orthodox Church, it can take people 2 years from being accepted as a catechumen to getting baptized. So he did eventually get baptized shortly after he cut up his cloak. He was about 18 years old when he got baptized, and he went through a pretty intensive process. But yeah, he was fully baptized even before he left the military.
That's good.
Absolutely. Yes, yeah.
It seems that no matter sort of what job he was placed in or whatever situation he was forced into or found himself, he managed to use that position in order to further the things that he believed in every single time.
Yeah, it's there's something that I try and like to live by, right? And it's if there's something you love and you're passionate about, you don't necessarily find time, you make time, right? And I think that's how he lived his life. He sort of resigned himself to knowing, I have to do all these things, but there's no way I can give this up. So any free second of his day, yeah, he was doing whatever he could to continue and to lead his faith, and I think that's admirable. I think for a lot of people, they get caught up in their lives and caught up in the busyness and what goes on in their lives and the things they love and are passionate about maybe fall by the wayside. He refused to let that happen in any situation he was in.
Well, I think I was feeling even more than that. He was using the position he was in, the advantages that gave him, for the purposes that he really believed in as well.
I definitely think so. Yeah, it's like I said, like the second he joins the military and he gets all these double rations, he doesn't keep any of it for himself. He knew immediately and intrinsically, okay, I'm given this privilege. How can I take this privilege I have and immediately apply it to my life of faith and my life of service? And not many of us would. I mean, if I was a Roman soldier, they did not eat well. They mostly ate like oatmeal and bread. They would maybe have meat once a month, once every couple weeks. So he would have better food than most people, but he didn't keep any of it for himself. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, he always found a way to take what he had and translate it into the true passion that he held, for sure.
He has this sense too that the essence of the faith that he's adopted is about service to the poor, and then he learns the Trinity and the divinity of Christ later, which is really beautiful because we do it the opposite way in the church now, right? We learn our beliefs first, and then once we're ready, we start to think about how that translates into service. But I think that's actually the right way around, like to look at the life of Christ and to say, okay, I'll just start by living like Christ lives, and I'll work out the theological stuff later on. Is really beautiful.
Yeah, especially because it's like I said, it's he didn't have any formal training, right? He would just listen to the gospel through a window. And so when that's what you're hearing, I'm sure as a young man, he went, oh, this Jesus fella kind of has a theme. He tends to help certain people pretty frequently, right? So I think that he just kind of listened, learned, and applied that, and the rest was just details. He had the message. Yeah. Dad.
Yeah, I just want to mention one thing. If you ever happen to be on a holiday in Europe and November 10th is coming up, go to this small town called Passchendaele in Belgium. And the St. Martin, just like we have St. Patrick's Day, right? Everybody knows St. Patrick's Day. Everybody knows St. Andrew, you know, for the Brits and everything else like this. For the Dutch and the Belgians and the Germans, St. Martin's big stuff. Like for hundreds of years, they've been recognizing his day, and his day being November 10th and 11th. And you may think it has to do with Remembrance Day. But you'll hear that in World War I, there was the Battle of Ypres. Well, there was really 3 battles of the Ypres, okay? The 3rd battle of the Ypres was called the Battle of Passchendaele. And that happened in 1916. And what happened then was they were doing a big offensive on what was called the salient, okay? And the New Zealanders were leading the British force, and they got wiped out. On the 16th of November, the Canadian Division, after they had done their business the Canadian Division was given the task of taking over for the New Zealanders. They took over the 1st of October, okay? On the 10th of November, St. Martin's Day, the Canadian soldiers took Passchendaele, finally took Passchendaele. From the spot they took over from the New Zealanders, they call it the Royal Lane. And there's a monument there to the Canadian troops. And it's a nice little avenue that goes right into the downtown square, okay? 700 meters, okay? 4,000 Canadians died taking that 700 meters. In the city of Passchendaele, every November 10th at sundown, all the kids in the town people have their lanterns, and they go to that Canadian Memorial for St. Martin's Day, and they all parade down the lane, okay? Remembering that these Canadian soldiers, like St. Martin, were soldiers who sacrificed themselves. They could never get over, why are these guys coming across the ocean to come in and save us? And they saw that sacrifice, and they recognize it every year at the December Festival. It's very moving because it's the evening of November 10th. But St. Martin is a big thing, that idea of sacrifice, serving others, and they applied it to Canadians. And if you're there, then please go. You'll find it just amazing.
Next up.
Firstly, thank you very much. Just an excellent time, Matthew. But I can't help but comment on this. So your dad was military.
Yeah.
Did he ever say to you?
I wish I had handcuffs.
I thought about it a lot.
Yeah, okay.
I really did. And actually, one of the things I thought about a lot was military chaplaincy.
All right.
There was always a very special relationship that the chaplains have with their soldiers, and that was something that, as Canadians living in Europe, we are very frequently invited to a lot of memorial or Remembrance Day services, all across Belgium and Germany and things like. Even as a high schooler, I was asked by towns to speak at these things, just as a Canadian who was a part of this military. So I definitely considered it. But now I'm engaged, and I think it's off the books.
Okay.
Much to his
Just a
disappointment.
fascinating
Yeah.
reflection
Handcuffed
on the
to
similarities there.
Yeah. If, God willing, if I ever have children, I will be, maybe suggesting it to them a little bit more vigorously. So we'll see. But yeah, I definitely thought about it for sure.
Yeah. Well, that was fabulous.
Well, thank you so much. Another round of applause for Matthew. Thank you so much. Absolutely. Yes, we have so much to learn from these amazing saints of our history, not least how to pronounce their names. So I think that's what I'll take away this evening.
Where they're from.
It was amazing. Yes, or where they're from. So thank you so much everyone for coming again this evening. Do join us on December the 14th, 9:30 here in the Crump Room for our first ever Coffee with the Saints, which will be a good time. Shonda Talisky will be doing a short presentation on St. Nick. And you've had a little introduction to those terrible people, the Arians, this evening, and you'll really then enjoy hearing about Santa Claus punching one in the face. The Arius himself, the leader of the pack. So do come and hear about that. And as I keep saying to people, I'm not joking, that actually happened. So that'll be fun. Please do donate on your way out to offset some of the costs of these wonderful evenings we put on. And if you would like to volunteer, either by providing a little bit of food, a little bit of wine or beer, we try and keep it very simple and modest. It's not a huge ask. You can speak to me or Brad. We'd love to get you connected with the email list. You'll receive those emails. And if you're interested at all or curious about the possibility of presenting at one of these things, then speak to me or Brad, and we'd love to chat to you about that and make it as unscary as possible for you. So yes, absolutely fantastic. So I think there's still some drinks available, and we will start wrapping things up. But thank you so much for joining us this evening. Bless you.
Great.